Thank you for being here. It's great to see so many of you as we continue to celebrate the environmental studies 40th anniversary. It's hard to imagine how quickly time flies. We are once again welcoming a Tufts alum back to campus to deliver today's presentation. I am not going to introduce today's speaker. One of her former teachers is going to do the honors. So I am here mostly just to sort of kick us off, to remind you that there are people on Zoom. So if you ask questions at the end, I will be bringing the mic to you. And if you are on Zoom, the chat is disactivated. So we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A on Zoom, and then I will bring the mic back to the computer and ask the questions of our speaker. I want to take this moment to thank the generous gift of two alumni siblings who endowed this lecture series, Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke. Through their generosity, we're able to do a much more expansive sort of anniversary celebration this year, bringing people from DC, for example, to give presentations. This is my point where if there's something exciting happening on campus related to the environment and you want to make an announcement, I will bring you the mic so you can make your announcement. Is there anybody who has anything they want to share? Okay. The other point is that we have a notebook that's going to go around that you can sign up to be on to receive weekly emails about the talk series. The talk will be recorded, as you heard at the beginning here. So you can also, if you know someone who wasn't able to come and they want to watch it, within 48 hours, it generally gets posted online. So feel free to tell your friends if you can watch it or share it with others. There's also our new weekly newsletter, and this has been really fun, a really important thing for students over the years. And they find internships, they find jobs, and they find information about courses. So it's like one click away from opening and taking a quick look to see if it's going to help you as students in your academic and in your career pursuits. We have people, other chairs back there that I'm going to just invite people to grab a chair if there are any chairs hidden anywhere. There's a chair here. There's a chair here at this table. So feel free to come forward and sit down. So at this point, I want to welcome Dr. Professor Madhumita Roy, who is the interim chair of the English department, who had the pleasure of teaching our esteemed speaker. Thank you for coming, Dr. Roy, and thank you for introducing today's speaker.
And thank you, Ninian, for allowing me. We had to arm wrestle each other to see who would introduce Miranda. And since this crowd likes recycling, I'm going to recycle something. It's a letter of recommendation I wrote for Miranda many years ago. And I do it for two reasons. One is, well, I'm recycling, but it'll give you a sense for how Miranda was as a student. And also because letters of recommendation are confidential. She has never heard me say any of this. And I wanted to, she's already embarrassed, but there's no reason to be. Maybe there is reason to be. So here's part of my letter of recommendation for her. I've known Miranda since her freshman year. This is in your senior year, when she took my upper level class on environmental justice and world literature. While she remains somewhat shy throughout the semester, she never shied away from engaging the class with her acute observations about the readings. It was during her class presentation that I saw Miranda emerge, quietly confident and wryly humorous. As was the case with her oral presentation, Miranda's written work was beautifully executed, thoroughly researched, and well-written. And here's the part I really wanted to read. Miranda came to Tufts with the idea of majoring in international relations, right? She didn't. So the next semester, fall 2014, she enrolled in the introductory course, Before I could check in with her about how the semester was going, I happened to see a column in the Tufts Daily about the intro to IR. It was Miranda's piece, and it dealt squarely with her disappointment with the content and focus of the course. Miranda's criticism was that the syllabus was not only tilted towards the US, more troubling to her was the fact that the assigned materials failed to take into account the intersection of race, class, and gender. She not only pointed out the bias, white and male, but went on to analyze the consequences of such a bias. She also suggested an alternative lens, ecofeminism, through which to reorganize the course and course material and topic. I certainly marveled at her courage. To critique a class while still enrolled in it takes a lot of guts. What I found especially impressive was the tone of the piece. Student newspapers can be full of passionate and angry invectives, and often the passion and the anger are justified and necessary. But they can also devolve into unproductive accusations. Miranda's piece struck me as simultaneously provocative and thoughtful. It was not a rejection of the course, rather it was an invitation to make it better by radically rethinking the premise and promise of international relations. Miranda's thoughtfulness and courage to stand up to make something better, not just for herself, but for the community, defines her personality. As you can see, I was prophetic. And here she is now to show us what she has done in the interim. So welcome, Miranda. It's lovely to see you again.
Wow, okay. Well, thank you for that so much. That was very kind. And thank you all for coming to my talk. So the title of my talk is Mounting Risks to Wetlands, a Journalist's Perspective. So before we get deep in the weeds on wetlands, I thought I would just reflect a little bit on my time at Tufts, and especially in the environmental studies department. Here are some photos of me while I was a student here. I guess I'm studying at Tisch Library there or something. But in all seriousness, you know, being an environmental studies major was certainly one of the best decisions I made while I was a student here. And it's really hard to name, you know, just a couple highlights, but obviously the classes and the professors really made the experience amazing. Really enjoyed my environmental justice and world literature class with Professor Roy, who really opened my eyes to the breadth of the global environmental movement and environmental justice issues. And I also worked on a thesis with Professor Stein, and that was a great experience that really helped me, I'd say, gain confidence to work on a project independently, which is really important for what I do now. And the focus of my thesis was looking at the manufacturing and environmental history in the community of Woburn, Massachusetts. And I also kind of focused on a particular site, manufacturing plant that had just closed down, and came up with an idea for how could this be adaptively reused to benefit the community and in a way that respects that history and heritage there. So in terms of what I do now, I'm a reporter for E&E News. I'm here on my own time and not representing E&E News, but that's where I work. And so we are an environmental news publication that covers all kinds of energy and environment and climate issues in depth, mostly focused on US issues. And we've got a lot of different reporters who focus on different aspects of this. And we make most of our money from subscriptions. Our readers include anyone who kind of works in environmental or energy issues, or you know, in an adjacent space, whether that's advocacy or in government. And what I focus on is water issues and water policy. So that entails focusing on drinking water issues, of course, contaminants like PFAS in drinking water, lead pipes. I also write about the broader watershed issues like rivers, river streams, lakes, wetlands, and issues affecting the watershed. And then I, of course, write about how this comes up in policy. So I'll write about federal legislation as it relates to water, or regulations that EPA comes up with or other agencies come up with, as well as how this is all playing out in the courts. So in terms of what my day-to-day looks like, I write a lot of daily update stories. Our readers really want to know what's going on, what is EPA doing right now, what's the decision in this lawsuit. So I'll do quick hits, but then I also will do feature stories where I get to dive into an issue in more depth and take more time with it. And sometimes I get to travel for stories. These are just a couple examples, and that's one of my favorite parts about my job. So wetlands. As many of you probably know, wetlands are areas where land and soil are naturally wet, either for all of the year or part of the year. There's a lot of diversity of types of wetlands. So marshes, bogs, cypress tree swamps like you see here. There's also regional specific wetlands, like prairie potholes in the upper Midwest, for example. And they provide a lot of ecological benefits. They're really important for a lot of different endangered and rare species. But they also have benefits for humans. Wetlands can hold a lot of water. So that's an extremely important function that they play when it comes to flooding and extreme weather. And they can help reduce the impacts of flooding on structures. But they also are important for water quality. They can help keep different pollutants out of larger rivers and streams and lakes, which keeps those water bodies cleaner and easier to treat to drinking water standards. So why am I writing about them? Well, as I mentioned, wetlands are very important for the quality of water that we drink and depend on for other uses. And they're also facing threats. This is not necessarily anything new. We've been filling in wetlands in the US for a long time, so that, people can build a shopping center or a house or an energy project, any kind of type of development. But I also write about them because the policy around them is somewhat fraught right now. So the extent to which wetlands are protected in the US, now more so than perhaps in previous decades, depends on which state you live. And there's the potential for a lot of state policies to change in the coming years. Also, issues affecting wetlands policy and how we manage wetlands is something that Congress is paying a lot of attention to still. There's not agreement in Congress about what to do, how far should we protect wetlands federally, and all this, unsurprisingly, could certainly be affected by the outcome of this election. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this law, the Clean Water Act. It was passed in 1972 or signed into law in 1972. It was bipartisan at the time. President Nixon, a Republican president, signed the law. And the key overarching goal is to restore and maintain chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So the law regulates not all waters, but waters of the United States. But it doesn't exactly define what those are. So we know that the Clean Water Act covers navigable waters, so a water that you could put a boat into and move that boat through. But in terms of how much it covers wetlands, that's a little bit less clear. But it seeks to accomplish the goal of clean water by requiring permits to pollute any water of the US. And if you don't have one of those permits, you can be fined, you can be prosecuted or face jail time. But under the law, pollutants is a pretty broad term. So it doesn't just mean, you know, putting chemicals or something into a river. It also means things like dredge and fill materials. So that's the term that's often used in the context of wetlands. Materials that you can put in a wetland to fill it and turn it into upland. In terms of the role of federal agencies, so federal agencies are sort of left to define which wetlands are covered under the law. And there have been some discrepancies in terms of how that's done under different presidential administrations. But in general, from the 1970s to the early 2000s, most wetlands that were adjacent to navigable waters were covered by the law, regulated under the Clean Water Act. And in practice, wetlands that had some water quality benefits were usually covered by the law. And notably, there's been some history of bipartisan support for this approach. So one example is in 1989, you had President Bush the first who established a goal that is, I believe, still in place in the US of no net loss of wetlands. And some states have also, a lot of states have also enacted wetlands policies over the years. So one example is Virginia. In 2000, they enacted some protections for wetlands in addition to the federal protections. And that was a law that was signed by a Republican governor. At the same time, that doesn't mean this has not been controversial. So you have, these are some articles that I found through the New York Times archives to kind of show how over the years, you know, there's been debate about what should we be permitting, how much should we be filling in our wetlands, how much should we allow. So this article from 1976 shows that home builders, which are one of the main industries that need and request these permits frequently to dredge and fill wetlands, they were opposing some policy in New York State at the time around wetlands protections. Also, even though wetlands are have been protected by the Clean Water Act to an extent, that doesn't mean you can't fill in wetlands, right? You just need a permit to do it. And lots of those permits have been granted over time. And as a result, we have lost a lot of wetlands. In terms of the reason why you have industry pushback, you know, these permits do add costs for industries that need them. You might need to hire some kind of wetlands consultant, you know, to show that you're trying to minimize impacts to wetlands as part of your permit terms, for example. Also, a lot of the time, if you have a very large project that's going to fill in a wetland, you will be required to pay for mitigation of wetlands. So basically, helping create or enhance a wetland somewhere else to kind of offset the impact. And so that comes with a cost. So there have been different Supreme Court rulings over the years about how many wetlands are covered, how many waters are covered under the Clean Water Act. But a really important one came in 2006. So the ruling Rapanos versus United States, the details of it were there was a developer in Michigan who filled in some wetlands with different materials to try to build a development project. And he ended up facing off with federal government, which said this is a protected wetland, and he disputed that. And eventually, after like 15 years or I think maybe 17 years, the case gets decided by the Supreme Court. And the verdict is pretty strange. So you have a 4-1-4 verdict. 4 justices voted to limit the number of wetlands covered by the law. 4 justices mostly sided with the federal agencies in their view of how far, how wetlands should be protected by the Clean Water Act. And then you have Justice Kennedy, who came up with his own kind of test for determining which wetlands are covered. So it's obviously kind of a confusing ruling, and sort of, I guess, unsettled. But in general, wetlands with some kind of significant nexus to navigable waters could mostly still be regulated under the Clean Water Act. Significant nexus was what Justice Kennedy came up with. Basically, if a wetland has a significant nexus to a water body, that can be, covered. That means it has some water quality benefits. Then more recently, there was this case, Sackett versus EPA. So this came just last year. And so, sort of similar situation. There was a couple that wanted to build a home on a part of their property near Priest Lake, Idaho. And they were facing fines from federal agencies who said this includes federally protected wetlands. You need to, restore it to its previous state. But they said, no, these aren't federally protected wetlands. And, case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court once again. And so all 9 justices actually agreed that this area on this property should not be a regulated wetland under the Clean Water Act. But then the more conservative majority on the court also had another, came up with another response. And so they basically said, from now on, only wetlands with a continuous surface connection to relatively permanent, standing, or continuously flowing bodies of water are federally protected. So this was a change. You no longer have this significant nexus. You now have continuous surface connection. The majority on the court also said, it should be so continuous that we can't even tell where the water begins and where the wetland begins. So this ruling was considered pretty significant, and it definitely makes it more difficult for the federal government to regulate a lot of wetlands, and basically says that they can't regulate a lot of wetlands. So now, according to the EPA, probably over 60% of wetlands in the US are no longer covered by the Clean Water Act. And even though, the specifics of the case were kind of local, right? You had a couple in Idaho, they wanted to build this home. The implications are much bigger. So in the briefs that were filed to the Supreme Court, you had a lot of support from different industry trade groups saying, yes, you need to do away with this significant nexus test. We need to have, fewer wetlands covered by the Clean Water Act. So they're all pretty happy about the ruling. An example of this, you have a quote from the president of the National Mining Association who said, this ruling shows there are clear limits to the federal government's reach when it comes to jurisdiction over water and land. But on the other side, you have real outcry from environmental groups and wetland scientists. And also the Biden administration as well, and EPA. So this is a quote from the head of the National Association of Wetland Managers, who calls the decision incongruous with modern science, and says it will manifest in serious negative consequences on public health, safety, water quality, et cetera. It's also just worth noting that this ruling does come at a time when the Supreme Court has seemingly been more sympathetic to deregulatory arguments, and more willing to reduce the power of federal agencies to regulate environmental issues and other issues at large. So it is, according to some legal scholars, part of a trend. So in terms of other implications, Now that the federal government is no longer regulating a lot of wetlands, it's kind of left to the states and even local governments to an extent to decide what to do about them. Should we protect them in some way or not? So you do have some states that are trying to fill this gap left by SACIT. This year, for example, Colorado enacted a new policy where they're going to oversee permits for wetlands that were previously covered by the federal government. And interestingly enough, because of some of the language in the ruling, states in the West are probably much more affected by this. So Colorado is one of those states, one of those arid states that's more impacted. But it's not necessarily easy for states that want to protect wetlands now. Setting up a new regulatory program costs money. It requires new personnel. So it's a big undertaking for states that want to do this. And also it's worth noting, watersheds don't necessarily fit neatly into state borders. So this is just a photo I found that shows some of the different watersheds that have some connection to the state of Missouri. So if one state enacts strong wetlands protections and another doesn't, if they have shared watershed, there could be shared water quality impacts. So in terms of stories I've written about this, this is just an example of a story I wrote earlier this year. And this one focused on states that were considering rolling back previous state laws they had on the books to essentially reduce regulatory requirements for wetlands now that the SACIT decision had come down. And what I ended up reporting was that there's this trend going on in a lot of states that are considering doing this, that are considering, reducing their wetlands protections. They are being influenced by home building associations. And so this story also showed that even in some states like Tennessee, for example, this year, they had a bill that was proposed that would do this. It didn't end up moving forward, but that lawmaker who proposed it was actually worked in development kind of industries himself. But this hasn't been without pushback from others in these states. So yeah, this shows the states I focused on in that story. Interestingly enough, in Tennessee, certainly when this bill was proposed to reduce wetlands regulations in the state, there was pushback from environmental groups. But you also had the head of the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency who spoke and testified at a hearing and said, we shouldn't do this. Tennessee has had pretty bad flooding over the years, and he was saying, if we start no longer requiring any kind of wetlands mitigation, flooding may go up. So moving forward, the Biden administration this year has been trying to protect wetlands using different tools other than the Clean Water Act in light of the SACIT decision. So they said that they want to protect or restore 8 million acres of wetlands. And that's through an initiative where they're trying to get states and private companies to partner with them on that. And meanwhile, Congress is definitely not in agreement on this issue. So last year, there was a bill proposed by Democrats in Congress that would have restored some wetlands protections, but Republicans don't support that. Also, there's still some discussion about, are the federal agencies under the Biden administration even implementing the SACIT decision? So I actually covered a hearing last week in the House where House lawmakers brought in people from the American Farm Bureau Federation, and there was some state regulators and others, and some of them were saying, we don't think the administration is really following SACIT. They're still trying to regulate too many wetlands. So that's definitely the position that industry is taking right now. And there was a suggestion that Congress codify SACIT into law at that hearing, which is, I don't think, going to happen under the current Congress, but worth paying attention to. So there's also still litigation. The Supreme Court ruling last year, I think there was some language from the majority on the court saying, you know, we really hope this is going to clarify this issue and make it very clear what wetlands are covered by the Clean Water Act, so that we're not having these debates all the time. But there are still debates going on, and there is still litigation. So there's a case in North Carolina, for example, that I've reported on a little bit. So there's a landowner there, you know, similarly wants to fill in some wetlands. He wants to build a sand mine in this case. But I used these quotes here because I thought it was interesting to show the different ways people talk about this issue. So you have a quote, this first quote is from the plaintiff in the case. And, you know, it's from his lawyers who said, Mr. White has invested his wealth in real property. He's unable to improve properties on his land to their highest and best use because the agencies are saying this is a wetland. And then you have an environmental group that has been intervening in this case. And they're saying, we actually have members who use this watershed, use the rivers nearby, and are concerned about impacts downstream from what this landowner wants to do. Yeah, so there's different language. At the same time as all this is happening, you know, wetlands, even before the SACIT case, are being lost in the US. So there was a report from the Fish and Wildlife Service that came out this year that looked at the last 10 years, 2009 to 2019, in terms of wetlands trends. And they reported that wetlands cover about half as much of the US now as they did in the 1790s, and that the rate of wetland loss increased from 2009 to 2019 compared to the previous 10 years. In terms of what's driving this, certainly wetlands are being converted to upland for all different kinds of uses. But also, in some areas, you have coastal wetlands that are being lost due to erosion and climate change. And this is a quote hot off the press. I just spoke to the former EPA Administrator for Water, Radhika Fox, yesterday. And she was reflecting on the SACIT decision, and you know, she predicted there will be public outcry in the future, potentially, as wetlands start to get filled in, but that's going to take a while because you know, things don't move so quickly. So, can we restore and create wetlands? Yes, we can, and we do. But you know, restoration isn't always so simple. Sometimes, often you have to monitor the area you're trying to restore to make sure something doesn't go wrong. I was actually at a wetlands conference earlier this year where people were talking about how beavers will constantly destroy wetlands that states are trying to create as part of their mitigation requirements. And also, when you destroy a wetland, even if you try to create one somewhere else, you don't necessarily, you know, not all wetlands are necessarily created equal, right? So one example of this is salt marshes. Salt marshes are prevalent in some states along the East Coast. And there's a species of bird called the salt marsh sparrow that only breeds in salt marshes and is now under review for Endangered Species Act protections because these marshes are being lost as, you know, due to development and sea level rise. So yeah, also on this question of restoration of wetlands, I did a story recently on a restoration project that Louisiana, the state of Louisiana is working on. Louisiana has some of the most significant wetlands loss right now, largely because of their land loss crisis that's going on. But the story I did focused on this area called the Atchafalaya River Basin. And the state project is being undertaken in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. The idea is to improve water quality in these cypress forest swamps that have been where there's just a lot of stagnant water. But there's also some opposition to this restoration project. So here's a map that just kind of shows the area that was in my story. So you can see the Atchafalaya River is this tributary or distributary of the Mississippi River. It actually probably would be the Mississippi River's main path to the Gulf of Mexico if it were not for an expensive engineering project that the US government has had in place for a couple of decades to prevent that from happening. That's kind of an interesting tidbit if anyone's interested in, I guess, river science more. But yeah, this area is considered the largest forested wetland swamp in the US. Much of it is privately owned, so there's a lot of development activity. There's oil and gas projects, pipelines, and then it's also because of its use by the Army Corps of Engineers for flood control and other needs. It's been there's been a lot of water quality impacts. So this restoration initiative is supposed to try to help with that, but it's actually being opposed by some other people who live in this area, including the Crawfishermen Association, as well as an environmental group, the Atchafalaya Basin Keeper. And it's kind of complicated science story, so I won't talk about that too much, but basically I think I tried to show that restoration sometimes is complicated when you have different ideas of what a place is supposed to look like naturally. And I think that's what is going on there to some extent. So yeah, in terms of how I cover these issues, you know, I try to remind myself that I'm not an expert or a lawyer or a scientist, but I do talk to those people, and I'm always trying to include all sides of an issue. That's very important for our publication, but I also think it's, you know, important to highlight facts, obviously, and context that might be necessary to explain people's positions. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much. So if you have a question, I will bring you the mic.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I have a couple of questions, but I'll just start with one so I can make sure everybody else gets a chance to ask. The first question was just like wetlands as land covered or interspersed with water present some pretty unique difficulties to like the US's system of defining someone's land or someone's property. I know that like it clearly has historically relied on like coastlines, clearly defined rivers, fences, or lines drawn as clear boundaries over like strong upland. And so what do you have to say about the challenges of defining boundaries and property ownership in wetlands when drawing lines on wetlands is so different from other ecosystems?
I don't know if I can answer that question super well, because I am not a scientist. I've also only been covering water issues for about a year. I mean, I think, yeah, can you rephrase your question maybe, or sorry?
No worries. I'm just thinking about it like if you're, for example, protecting a forest, there's a pretty clear line you can draw on land that says this point is where we're going to start protecting the forest. And if you're like maybe even doing an ocean, like this reef is what we're protecting. I feel like a wetland kind of presents a difficult scenario where it's like it's both land and water.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of why it's been, why it's hard to say what's a wetland in law. And so I think the federal government for a long time sort of like there was this sense that like the agencies that are, you know, permitting projects under the Clean Water Act, for example, like should have discretion to say, you know, here's the scientific specifics of this particular area, and here's why we think this is a wetland and why it should be, you know, covered under law. So I do think that what I agree with you, like wetlands are challenging for that reason, because I think sometimes it's really case specific. And, you know, there's like hydrological features, and it's sometimes, you know, especially an area that's not always wet. So yeah.
I found one of your comments at the end, like what is natural, so interesting in terms of thinking about restoration, but more generally, I think it's fascinating. I would love to hear you reflect on, it seems like wetlands are messy, really hard to cover, lots of competing interests, lots of definition issues. Can you compare your sort of level of enthusiasm for covering a messy topic compared to maybe some other topics? I don't want to say that any of your topics have not been messy, but is this an unusually challenging but also invigorating topic to cover?
Maybe. Yeah. I think yeah, I mean, I think I like writing about it because like there's a lot going on right now. And so, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on at the state level. There's, you know, conversations in federal government and in the courts. So I think, yeah, it's, but also most of what I write about, I guess, is kind of messy or technical. And so I'm always trying to like, make it as clear as possible to readers to understand, even if they don't have that like really scientific background.
We'll come back.
Hi. So I'm wondering, you talked a bit about, you know, wetland protections, you know, as a whole, and also a bit about, you know, some individual species that are, you know, rely on wetlands that are threatened, like the salt marsh sparrow. And I'm curious, like, what do you think, you know, the relative importance of those is in terms of like, you know, is it better to go for like, you know, broad protections, or like specific protections on specific species that may be threatened, or like, you know, especially like, you know, given that there was this recent Supreme Court decision that, you know, was a major setback for like broader wetlands protection, is, you know, is these more specific protections, you know, a good substitute with, you know, when you don't have that?
Yeah. I think yes. Because it does seem like there's for people who want to protect wetlands, they're sort of looking to the Endangered Species Act, I think, to figure out how they can do that in some cases. Like, because, you know, if an area is not a federally protected wetland, if it has an endangered species on it, then maybe you still can't destroy it. Or you still have to, you know, take action to try to minimize impacts to that species. So I think that that is something that, you know, environmental advocates are thinking about in the post-Sackett landscape.
Hi, I was wondering in your coverage of wetlands, if you've kind of seen or heard broader conversations about property and like how we use our land, and, you know, like why in our society we feel entitled to fill in a wetland for our houses, and like if there's been bigger conversations about reframing how we use and live among different landscapes in our environment.
Yeah, I think that is kind of a big part of all this. Yeah, I mean, in terms of people who are supporting, you know, a more narrower Clean Water Act that protects fewer wetlands, that's exactly the argument they often make, is that this is like a private property issue. And that, you know, we should be able to do what we want with our land. But obviously, under the Clean Water Act, you know, water is protected to some extent. So that's why I think it's kind of nebulous, and because wetlands are this in-between space.
So kind of building upon the question about borders and lines being drawn, I guess, something you mentioned is that wetlands don't care about borders or anything. Like, they go across local borders, state government borders, defined by that jurisdiction. And something that I'm curious about is how, in your investigations and people you've met with, how are you seeing that policymakers and people in government are trying to come to consensus upon these issues when wetlands and bodies of waters spread across a variety of local government and like federal government areas, I guess?
That's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer to it. Yeah, because I guess what you're getting at is if you have like a large wetland that like part of it is in one state and part of it's in another state, you know, what can be done in the different states? And I don't know the answer, and I don't know, maybe I don't know if anyone in the audience does, but yeah, that's a good question.
What was the question again?
The question was, I think, what happens when, I think you were saying what happens when a wetland covers different jurisdictions, and then how much is it going to be protected?
First of all, Miranda, great to see you. John Rumpler, Clean Water Director with Environment America, based here in Boston, also class of 1988. So always great to be back here. Several recent Tufts students have interned with us on our clean water program. Miranda mentioned in one of her slides, environmental groups. I'm one of those environmental advocates that calls Miranda and her predecessors on this issue all the way back to the Rapanos case in 2006 when I started working on wetlands. My question, the answer on jurisdiction and different jurisdictions, I should just clarify that even if the Clean Water Act doesn't protect wetlands, there are other federal laws that may protect some wetlands. So if there are wetlands in a national park, they're protected by the laws that protect national parks, or a national wildlife sanctuary, or something like that, or some other state program. So I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but there are different ways to protect wetlands other than the Clean Water Act. It's just the Clean Water Act is kind of a one-stop shopping way that until this most recent disastrous Supreme Court decision, we could protect almost all of our wetlands. My question, though, Miranda, to you, if I may, is you talked a lot about Supreme Court decisions, you know, Rapanos in 2006, and lots of things that happened, but then fast forward to Sackett recently last year, this really disastrous decision on wetlands. When I think about it, though, in some ways, if we want to solve this problem, the biggest court we need to think about is the court of public opinion. And I'm wondering, Miranda, what does the polling tell us about the public's understanding of wetlands, how important they are for filtering out pollutants, protecting communities from flooding, wildlife habitat, et cetera?
I don't know what the polling tells us. I mean, in general, most Americans will say that water is like the most important environmental issue for them. And so I know that is the case. But from talking to different people, like for one of my stories that I mentioned earlier, I spoke to someone who was involved in Virginia's program. I mentioned that they have a wetlands protection program there. And he was involved in it, I guess, back when it was passed in 2000. And he told me, like, yeah, I mean, people don't like seeing wetlands filled in, and eventually people are going to be upset about this if it keeps happening. So I can offer that tidbit.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat. It says, have you covered efforts to protect cities from flooding and how to incorporate natural sinks or wetlands
to the Army Corps of Engineers' tendency to want to erect big dams? Specifically, have you looked at New York City and the Hudson River Bay or Jamaica Bay?
I've definitely written about cities or, places where flooding is a concern and how you can reduce that. I haven't written much about New York City, but I know that there's a big Army Corps of Engineers project there that I think came after Superstorm Sandy in 2012, and is still sort of in development phases, and may look at natural features as a part of that solution to increase storm surge and that kind of thing. Yeah.
So I'm going to change the trajectory of these questions and ask you to talk a little bit about your journey, having graduated from here and then becoming an environmental journalist. What were the steps you took? What are some advice you might give those who might be aspiring to that profession?
Yeah. Well, after I graduated, I started as a local reporter. I worked at a newspaper here in Medford, and then I worked at another newspaper in Las Vegas. And then I started at E&E News. So I guess advice you said. I mean, if you want to be a journalist, try to get as much experience doing reporting as you can. And also, I would say try to stand out in some way, especially if you're at a small local paper, figure out how you can make your story bigger potentially, or regional or something like that. And ask a lot of questions, and including dumb questions. So.
You took a leap of faith when you went to EE News for the first time, because it wasn't a permanent position when you went there. So can you talk about your ability to take a leap of faith?
It was a leap of faith. I started as a fellow there, which was not a permanent position and an hourly salary. And I had left the newspaper in Las Vegas for that. And I remember it was like early pandemic kind of, and I spoke to some journalism professor who I knew, and he was like, I don't think you should do that. I think it was a good move because it was just, I finally was at a place where, we had a much bigger focus. It wasn't just local news, and even though I've had a great experience in local news, there's just not a lot of resources in it right now, and so it's hard to find mentors, and it's hard to figure out how you can improve other than just doing stories yourself. So E&E just has really good reporters who've been there a long time and good editors, so going was definitely the right move because it helped me just become a better reporter.
So it's an example of an internship that became a permanent position.
Yeah.
Hi, can you share an interesting travel story from your work?
Well, definitely the story I did in Louisiana was interesting. I mean, the Atchafalaya Basin is this area that has these, massive cypress trees, and it's very important for migratory birds. And it's just really beautiful to be in, but also, it has an interesting culture and identity as well. It's the last area that where there's wild caught crawfishing in Louisiana, and very rich like Cajun history and identity there. So yeah, that was definitely a good one.
Hello. I have a question about like the kind of the court of public opinion aspect of it. I feel like if more people like knew about wetlands and like the broader environmental happenings, like I feel like they would be more interested in it. But when I think to people like my mom and my dad, they watch big news television and like big news journalism that, the stuff that takes up the most mind share, time share, whatever you want to call it. So how does one go from reporting at this level to something that will be actually seen enough to impact the sort of like court of public opinion?
Yeah, I think it's difficult and certainly something I, we write primarily for an audience of people who kind of like know a lot about this stuff, know more than me, frankly. And so I'm always kind of thinking about how can I make my story broader and have broader appeal to people who, don't really know anything about wetlands, for example. But yeah, I think, I don't know. I think we'll have to see what happens in the next few decades with wetlands and with flooding. Obviously climate change is getting worse, and wetlands are very important for, storm surge, reducing storm surge and things like that. So there may be more attention on this issue in the future.
Okay, then I have a student back here. Okay. We have a couple more minutes. So I'm going to pass it to the student who had a question.
Hi, I'm curious to know whether you've ever covered stories regarding like in wetlands on indigenous land or regarding like jurisdiction relating to wetlands that are on like indigenous reservations in the United States, or discussed with controversy of that?
I haven't, but hopefully in the future. Yeah.
Well, this is such a rich conversation, and I'm kind of mindful of us coming to close, but I'm going to give the last question here.
So actually it was a segue from the previous one about swaying the public opinion. So it made me wonder, how do you choose your titles for your stories? What goes into thinking about that? I mean, because I imagine the main objective is to hook people, especially that are not already an expert in those fields. So tell us a bit about the thought process behind choosing the right title.
Yeah, I think, the headline's really important. And sometimes it's a decision the editor makes. I guess like they always have the last say on the headline. But yeah, I guess you want to combine something eye-catching, something that people are already talking about or thinking about. But it is kind of an art because you have to be, short. And then we have, and many publications we have like a deck as well. We call that the deck, where you sort of have a little line that gives a little more context. That's like the first thing people read. So that's sort of a way to try to fit more into the first thing people see, I guess.
Well, thank you for just a wonderful presentation, Q&A. Please join me in thanking Miranda and welcoming her back to Tufts.